Hi.
Hi, Amelia. Thank you so much for being part of our podcast, Women Artists from Latin America. I feel such a privilege to meet you and to know your work. You have an outstanding trajectory as an artist. But for the audience that might not know you, I want to start from the beginning. Where did you start? What got you into the arts? How was your initial process as an artist, as an Argentinian artist now living in London?
So thank you for having me. I don't know. I grew up in Patagonia in a small city called Cipolletti, and I I don't know. I used to do a lot of cutouts as a kid, and I liked drawing. But as a teenager, I sort of became interested in being an artist more than it wasn't that I was so into making, but I had like a lot of friends who were musicians. I did a bit of theater. My grandmother was a theater director. So in my beginning, I thought maybe I was going to do like set design or so I still have maybe still that relationship to performance and to props and to how objects can also contextualize space and our actions within it. And but then as I grew a little bit, I went to on an exchange as a high school student to Australia, and I had a really good art teacher there. And I think she was the first one that taught me that you could also think that it wasn't all just about intuition. I was a very good student. I really liked reading, and I was the teacher's pet. So I thought that maybe if I were to like choose to be an artist, there will be other sides of me that I wasn't going to develop. And she was the first one that showed me that you can be an artist and also think and talk and write.
Which is fantastic because previously I was talking with a different artist as well about that professionalization. I don't know, like becoming a professional artist and what does that imply, and the immense research that it comes from developing a practice.
Yes.
And I wanted to also dive into that. How is your studio process? How do you envision all this very diverse artworks that we're seeing here in the booth with so many different media? How do you build up a process, a project, and how does it come to life from idea to manifestation?
Yeah. So first of all, I think that idea of art being your profession is something that doesn't really sink in until it's really happening, but it can be very problematic. Like it is, I think at the beginning you think, oh, well, I have these ideas and I want to make them, and maybe you don't have that many opportunities. But as when that becomes your job, even on the days that you feel off, you also have to show up. But you start to build a relationship to your practice that it is that one of a continuity, and you realize that you can make things in any mood, and that sort of inspiration doesn't always look the same.
Yes.
And that ideas, like my process is never the same. Sometimes I have an idea and that's where I start. Sometimes I don't know what to do, and so I start playing around with what I have. But generally speaking, my process is very much guided by ideas. I don't think of my work or my development as an artist as a line, but more as a constellation. So there are interrelated sets of ideas and questions that worry me or interest me, and then I keep coming back to them with renewed interest. And what happens is I think I'm also very, very interested in form. So I try to keep that sort of process of thinking about forms and making forms from what I'm thinking, to try to keep it as close as possible so that one thing is constantly influencing the other. So I don't know what does it mean if I make it big? What is that saying with my concept? It's like, and so it's always kind of a constant dialogue.
An ongoing research in a way.
Yeah.
And it's interesting what you mentioned before, this forcing idea that we need to produce a result in order to become an artist. But in reality, it's the research process as well. It's the process of diving into different ideas, exploring them further. And I wanted to start with that in order to observe the works that you're exhibiting here and with Proyectos Ultravioleta, because as I was mentioning before, we see artworks that are completely different to one
Yes.
another, from geometric abstraction to expressionist abstraction with
Yes.
weaving, with objects, drawings, very methodic drawings, very slick, white, organized drawings. So guide us through the artworks that you are showing here.
Yes, sure. I always like to joke that my solos look like a group show. So there's all this. I just have built a practice for myself that allows me to do whatever I want, which I think it's our main jobs as artists, is to be able to have a practice that can also incorporate what's happening in your life. So the set of drawings, it's called Joy in Paperwork, and they are made with stamps that I use for different bureaucratic processes. They're bought at Ryman's or whatever your local stationery is, and they are in different languages. And I started this series when I was trying to apply for British citizenship. So I lived in Europe for over a decade with an Argentinian passport, and therefore spent a lot of money, a lot of time, and a lot of anguish in lawyers' fees, and worried about whether I could remain where I was living. And so I started an immigration process in the UK, and I applied for citizenship, and it was denied on the basis that I didn't spend enough time in the country. But I wasn't living elsewhere. It was just that my career was giving me opportunities to travel.
No.
And so, exactly. So the Home Office was very interested in, like, how did I make a living and why did I travel so much? And it was so hard for me to prove that and to explain that. And so I had to gather evidence
it was a part of your success as an artist.
Exactly, and that it was like following the opportunities, and that I was really based in the UK, but and so because I didn't have a job or a boss that I could could say she travels for this and that. So I had to start gathering evidence of all the trips that I had done in the previous 10 years for maybe a lecture or a show, and asking those curators and those museums and those institutions to write me letters to say that I had traveled for work. And then, so we submitted that application, and it was rejected on the basis of stay. And so the lawyer said, you need to stay put. So you're not going to travel. So I got my friends to send me all these stamps from all different corners of the world in different languages. And I sat in my studio for a year and worked on this series of drawings. There are 1,000 drawings. And they started as me trying to subvert the grid. So I thought, okay, they're called Joy in Paperwork. And it was me trying to exactly find that, to try to, we often feel the bureaucracy is overwhelming and difficult, but it also, if you're not part of that bureaucratic machine, you then become an outsider. If you can't access that paperwork, you are just like stateless somehow. And so I thought, well, it's also a privilege to partake in bureaucracy and to be able to do it. And so how can I inject joy, and how can joy be an act of resistance? So joy is a very important element in my work as well. Anyways, as I did 1,000, I started to fall in and out of figuration, and then became more and more playful. But this particular series is related to that personal moment and that relationship with paperwork.
I want to stop you there for a minute.
Yes.
Because I want to go back to this idea of joy and humor.
Yeah.
Because as you mentioned, this is something that we can see on and on in your practice, that even tackling very dense and very complex subjects that you address in your practice relating to Argentina and your current life, you always address them in a very witty, joyful way, trying to subvert that tension, which I somehow see as well with your objects that you have exhibited here as well.
Yeah.
So guide us through these objects and how they came to be, that also have a lot of paperwork on their
Yes, exactly. So they are called paperweights, and they somehow are a little bit of it's in this particular presentation, they're the hinge between the two worlds, that sort of more intimate sphere of the home and that while the work and the office and administration. So they're called paperweights, and they're sculptures that are made with objects that met at my table during the pandemic. So it was that idea of the home office or the work that you bring home, and how there were all these different like objects from when I went for a walk and collected something. But then when I was using tape to tape something in the studio, I'm playing with my young son. And so they're or cooking something or
An actual mandarin.
that's an actual mandarin. Yes. So that's also kind of a bit of a fruit bowl. And so they are like these incongruous encounters somehow that then sit at the desk on top of what you were doing already. And so I'm a very, very messy person, and I try to keep.
By watching your
No,
it doesn't look like that at all.
One of the persons that I worked with very, very early on, his name is Mark Fox. He was my first gallerist. He once came to the studio and he said to me, people should never come here. It's like, you don't want to know where these things come out from. Like, I did not have a beautiful practice at all. And there was another curator that also was one of the first supporters that used to do this joke. It's like, you enter the studio and then you follow the piles and piles of garbage, and there at the end is the artist. Yeah, totally. So my desk is constantly messy, and then the last thing I did like goes on top. So that's why I sort of call them paperweights.
It's wonderful if you see them together as a dialogue of bureaucracy.
Yeah.
Way. And especially because all these paperworks are empty.
Yes.
But in a way, it creates this illusion to the emptiness of bureaucracy and all these paperwork that you feel they are very important, but at the end of the day, they just probably throw them away. Or I don't know what they do with this amount of paperwork that they have about us.
Yes.
And our process migration. Continue with this artworks because in a way part of this series of podcasts that we're developing right now has this theme of migrating artists and how much the practice of an artist changes, mutates, adapts, and incorporates the new country where you're based and all the different process of migrations that you probably as an artist have traveled around the world. So how much of your practice have been influenced by the fact of living in the UK, as an Argentinian artist living in the UK?
Yeah.
And before you answer this, I feel, I don't know, that perhaps, and this is a question that I want to ask you as an artist, if the fact of being an Argentinian in the UK has forced you also to address your own national identity as this is something that I have to do, or do I want to do it as well? So let me try to answer one question at a time. I think with this idea of whether you are, in my case, like an Argentinian artist or not, it's when I was in Argentina, still before I left, I was making work about education and being at school and how we learn through images and how that shapes our ability to imagine and how history in particular is taught, national history was taught through images. And to be honest with you, I didn't like become an Argentinian artist until I left Argentina, because there I was just an artist and I was making work about history. And then suddenly when I left, I was making work about Argentinian history. And so for a while, I tried to not be so specific with my references, because mostly I just didn't want the work to be experienced in translation constantly. And for people who have to believe me that everybody in Argentina thinks that this monument is yellow, but it's actually white, like I didn't. So I try to look for other ways. So in a way, that was a question that appeared naturally, I guess, but it is not something that you feel you need to address unless you leave the place in a strange way. So I grappled and wrestled with site specificity for a very long time. And then have revisited it at different times when I feel like a particular history or a particular moment in time
is relevant to me. You know, like every place has a history. It's just whether it is relevant to you. In terms of like me moving around, I think as someone who is like still interested in objects, it did mean that for a while my practice became very light because it needed to move around with me. And then there are moments where you get an invitation where something can be like situated or permanent, and you can explore like a bigger
Size
scale. Yeah,
volume.
exactly.
Weight.
Yeah.
And how much has your practice been influenced by living in the UK and your relationship perhaps with other Latin American artists living in the UK or even UK artists as well? How much has that informed your practice?
It's really like that is very hard to say specifically. I think that there is something about language. For example, us having this conversation in English, I feel like so much of my work is also thinking about the work, and I feel very, very comfortable in thinking about my work in English. So I think there is definitely a relationship to language and the sort of me being a person that had to struggle a lot to gain access to paperwork and bureaucracy. And now me also having a child that is about to enter schooling in the UK, which is like, because I've been so interested in education, I kept sort of referring back to my own education. And now suddenly I'm sort of, I wasn't educated in the UK, but suddenly I'm sort of trying to understand this educational system. Or so I would say that it's sort of living in London is also this kind of opportunity, this melting pot of different ideas and conversations. So I think it's definitely been very, very influential, but I feel like I had burnt myself previously with sort of trying to preempt who the people that are going to see my work are and what they know. And so I became wary of trying to determine that. I made a project, for example, when I was in my early years of arriving in the UK, in which I had a nomadic sculpture that traveled from home to home and that people got to host. It was part of a project at Chisholm Hill Gallery, and people could sign up, and the sculpture traveled throughout the borough for a year. And we organized the exchange of hands, and that was like a meeting point. And that was me saying, I am very happy to be part of this community, and I'm happy to put my work in the hands of this community, but I'm not going to try to preempt who this community is and how they're going to read a particular work.
Yes, because you have a lot of site-specific installations, particularly in London.
Yes.
And how do you build those installations to be part of the place where they are? Because there are a few, and that must be really exciting. How do you build the projects around this site-specific installation? How do you observe the space around it and build a project that goes along with it? Because
well, that usually it's also that sense of place that isn't just the place. For example, there is one that it is under an underpass, which is connected to Battersea Park. And so obviously this idea of the British park and the species that came from other places. And so I decided to work with a microbiologist, and we looked at the microscopic life of the park. And then I was sort of interested in collecting these sort of fun facts about how the invisible world impacts the visible work in the park, or the world that we perceive in the park. For example, there's this mural, and then there's these bits of information that I worked with the scientists to collect, and where they teach us that like this bacteria that you see here in this microscopic image is the one that makes the soil smell like it's about to rain when it rains. So things like that. Or for example, now at the moment I'm working in Cambridge for a new artwork for the new children's hospital that is going to be a permanent commission. So it is mostly about the people who are using the space. In this case, it's going to involve children, obviously, and it's going to be for them and somehow giving them a voice as well. So I think I now like to think about it more in relationship to who the people that use the space are and what they might bring to the artwork, rather than me trying to think about the history of a particular
that's
site.
fantastic, because in a way it's a useful space. It's a space in use.
No.
So this performative actions that the people that use the space do with your work as well,
Yeah.
is what makes it so interesting. I want to use that to go through the two other
Sure.
sets of series that you're
Yes.
exhibiting here. Here we are observing a set of geometric abstractions. Guide us through this one in particular.
So this is I love this straddling the supposed division between figuration and
Yes,
abstraction,
exactly.
or the world of geometry and the world of like free form, if you want to call it. But so these are actually highly figurative works. They just look very very abstract, but they are based on tabletops. So these are called studies for rearranging the conference table. I was very lucky to win the Zurich Art Prize, which is a prize that is also a solo exhibition in Haus Konstruktiv, which is a museum in Zurich, which is obviously a museum dedicated to constructivism, both historically and how contemporary artists sort of feed from it. So these shapes that you see on the wall are actually originally they're downsized to half the scale and half the size of tabletops, and tabletops in particularly of those that are used in big corporations and offices to create conference tables. These are usually sold as modular furniture, and they come in three shapes: a half circle, a trapeze, and a rectangle. And with that, you're able to arrange them in a conference room to suit the shape of the conversation and the size of the party that you want to accommodate. And so what I did is I sort of almost like bought them off the shelf, but just worked on getting new tabletops for them and designed them in these colorful geometrical patterns that would allow for combinations that were kaleidoscopic and guided by formal pleasure and experimentation, rather than by functionality of the meeting that was about to take place on those. So these, in this particular solo show at Haus Konstruktiv, you had 14 tables that had these sort of geometric designs that were on wheels, that every day there would be a movement. So every day they would change a little bit, and guided by the shape that these were creating in the way that they were put together. They would create new forms, but then there was also like an invitation to reimagine what the conversation would look like, how that changed the hierarchy. And it was again going back to the idea of how shape and formal changes can also inform the performance around them and the ideas that we have. And so these ones are studies for that. They have size, they're still made out of Formica, but basically they are tabletops looked from above. So obviously they look incredibly abstract.
But I wanted to ask you, where the audience invited to sit down afterwards?
Well, so there were no chairs, and also there were no chairs. It was just the tables. And originally we thought that this could be a performance, that it will all happen at once, and people might come in, or that people might be able to move them, or that. And then the pandemic hit. So the show happened in 2020, and so what we had guards, the museum guards doing one movement a day, almost like the changing of the guards. It would happen like once every day, always at the same time, and they would like rearrange the table. And so through that idea, there was also in the space there was the audio of office life, which was audio that I downloaded for free, that was available during the pandemic for those people who found it hard to concentrate at home without the sound of the office, which I did like a complete ready-made and totally up for grabs for people. But it was sort of, I went from like planning this show as like, bureaucracy and how overwhelming it can be, and how we need to inject pleasure and joy into this working and corporate environment, and also playing with this Swiss joke around constructivist art and how it was like office art that was used to decorate walls. And then suddenly the pandemic hits and we all become very nostalgic of going to the office and
the void. Then it became a reference to the void.
Exactly.
Of empty offices.
Of empty offices.
That's a fantastic metaphor there then.
And then that is when sort of you go back to the paperweights that were this sort of home office situation. And then we get to the home, which is the more sort of expressionist, as you call it, work in the presentation.
To put it in a name, but because here you also weave, so is that
they're embroidered.
They're embroidered.
So they're not woven. It's embroidery on fabric, and basically they are based on drawings done by my son, who is 3 years old. And it's just before.
He draws very well. FYI.
I know. Thank you. He's a genius.
I also have a 3-year-old son, but oh my god, like really good drawings for his.
Well, they're very small originally.
No, but still, wow, fantastic.
But it is this exploration of mark making before we have any expectation around figuration in drawing. And I am very interested in that, as I was telling you, in this relationship that we establish with images around whether they represent something or not.
Yes.
Because I think it's the way in which we question whether we can understand or read an image. And that establishes a very important link to language and how, as a sort of an artist of my generation, we completely inherited that question from the conceptualists about what the relationship between art and language is.
And our ability to understand them.
Yes.
That's why we...
And for me, this question is key because I am from a small town that doesn't have a museum, and I'm very interested in how a regular person that might really want to enjoy an artwork might feel intimidated by contemporary art and might feel that they don't understand it. There's always like this question of understanding and what the role that understanding plays or being in the know plays when looking at contemporary art.
It's interesting because it's funny how the very words that we use in order to define it is what end up making it more confusing.
Exactly. Exactly. So what I did is I took one of the drawings of my son and I made it large and I embroidered it like, well, I worked on 6 at the same time. So it was a team of us. I did embroider, but I wasn't the only person embroidering. But
it's very labor consuming.
Yes, in fact, the time that it takes is listed as material, as if it was a durational piece.
Wow.
And it's a little bit about that tension of doing something very, very quickly, like he did, this gesture, and then this sort of motherly love of trying to keep these moments.
Yes.
But also the long-lasting impact that early years have in the shaping of a person and in the shaping of an imagination of the person. So obviously it's a little bit about him being my son and this being maternal love, but also it is about sort of how impactful those early years are informing our imagination and how we
and observing the world.
Yeah, and how we don't look or imagine or create from intuition or some sort of singular stroke of genius, but how that is so cultural and so informed by the things that we have seen and learned and been told.
Absolutely, and in a way, for me, it's funny because I always remember how, as a child, they always tell you, this is how a tree is drawn.
Yes, exactly.
And then when I became an artist, it's like forgetting everything and try to see what does a tree look like in reality, not like...
Exactly.
And this exploration of like a innocent mind would have of the world is fantastic.
Yes. And there's also the question of motricity and ability, which I think it's so crucial when people look at art, not particularly my work, let's say, but how virtuosity or the ability to draw, but also the inability might influence what the image looks like, and how maybe it doesn't matter whether you end up with this image because you didn't know how to draw something,
Yes.
or because you chose not to represent something.
Yes.
And so I think when we make art, we're also teaching ourselves how to make the work that we can only make.
Yes.
And so it's a constant sort of process of learning,
Yes.
but also as unlearning those sort of stereotypical ways that we've been taught to
Observe.
represent things.
Yes. I wanted to finish, Amalia, with the future.
Mhm.
What are your current projects? What are you working on right now? And what are your future projects, exhibitions, etc.?
Yeah, so I've just come from a really busy period. I've just opened a show in New York at Tanya Bonagdar Gallery, which is my first solo show there. Now I'm doing this solo presentation in ARCO. So for the next few weeks, I'm taking a break. Yes, I'm really excited to be one of the jury members for New Contemporaries.
Wow.
So I'm going to
that's so
sit in a room and be
Wow.
showered by
New
artwork
artworks.
made by younger artists, which I'm really, really looking forward to. In terms of longer term projects, I'm working in this, besides shows and stuff, but I'm working in this hospital commission, which is something that I'm super excited about. I think it's obviously me having a child at home, but also even before my experience as a parent, my interest in early years and in how imagination is formed, but also in what art can do for people and what the role that art can play in a therapeutic environment like a hospital, and this possibility of art being also a joyful experience as well as an invitation to think critically, how those two things can go hand in hand. It just feels like this commission can be this perfect place for me to explore this with the longevity of it being a permanent piece. So while it's something that sometimes it's on the side of what I do for my exhibitions or my galleries or museums or in my studio, suddenly this project feels very central to my interest at the moment.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for this lovely conversation and watching and understanding a bit further of your work. I look forward to seeing all these projects. Please share us so we can share with our audience. And thank you so much, Emma.
No, thank you for having me. No.